Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I was contacted back in November, a few months ago, by Catalina Stark, who is doing her graduate work with the University of Florida, specializing in ecology, geology, and had a very strong interest in soil and water science, and asked me to link her up with an environmental professional that specializes in wetland restoration projects. She has a course that she wanted to interview someone, and I said, let's put this together. And not only would it be great for Catalina to talk with John Lesman of Biotech Consulting, but also let's put this on video for students that are also interested in the ecological restoration industry, and they could get the insights from John Lesman as well. So I'd like to introduce both Catalina Stark with the University of Florida and also John Lesman with Biotech Consulting. Real quick, John Lesman and I have known each other for 16 years. We met in 2004. He has been in the industry way longer than that, though. In the 90s, he was with the South Florida Water Management District. And so he got a lot of his expertise and experience from there. And then in 2004, he went to the private sector with Biotech Consulting, which is a thriving environmental consulting company that not only helps with the wetland mitigation to be used for, but also creates wetland mitigation banks. So they have a dual functionality, which is pretty rare in Florida to be able to take care of both aspects. So John, do you want to give a little bit more information on your success and career?
Sure. Hi, Victoria. How are you doing? It's good to be here. I started back actually around 1990 in this field. I went to school prior to that in Albany University for my bachelor degree, and then I went to University of Central Florida to get my master's degree, and that's how I ended up here in Orlando. That's where I'm located, and that's where our main office of Biotech Consulting is located. We also have offices in Tampa and Jacksonville and Vero. But we had, is there anything else you need to know from there other than, or do you want me to talk about anything in particular?
I think that's good. I know Catalina has a list of questions. Catalina, tell us a little tiny bit about yourself, and then we'll jump off into your interview.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I want to start out by saying that I am excited to talk to the both of you and just get to know more about, what makes you tick. I am currently an undergrad at the University of Florida pursuing a combined master's degree in ecological restoration. And a course that I'm taking, the ecology and restoration of the longleaf pine ecosystem, asked me to do an interview with a restoration professional. So I talked to you, Victoria, and she said, I know the perfect guy, John. So that's who we're with today. And I hope to go I don't know why. I hope to go somewhere with my education and build a career in wetland restoration, mitigation, delineation, anything wetlands. There's just a special place in my heart for it. So
great.
I'm working slowly but surely. We'll get there.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, well, let's jump into it. Catalina, you got the floor.
Okay. Well, John, Victoria was telling me a little bit about yourself. I know you've got lots of experience. You work for biotech, but what really got you into the environmental field? What sparked that interest in you?
Okay, that's a really good question. I guess I would describe it this way. Ever since I can remember, I was always interested in animals, and I used to, even when I was really young, I used to look at ants moving around and lizards, and I caught lizards and snakes as I grew up, and was always interested in that. I was always interested in camping and the outdoors, and that's pretty much the way it goes. I called it more of I always felt like I was a little bit of an explorer, because I always thought that the most interesting thing you can do in the environmental field is when you walk out on a piece of property that you haven't been to before, and you're just trying to figure out what's there, what you're going to find, who knows, what kind of animals, what kind of plants, those kind of things. That's really what got me into it.
Okay. I can completely resonate with that. I have two sons and excuse me, and they are constantly in the backyard. One has a little bug catcher, and so I get it. And even from an early age, I was really interested in just playing with dirt, which is strange for girls, I guess. But I get that. So, are you, Victoria, was telling me about you, and I also read some of your bio on biotech on the website. So you do permitting, but you also do wetland restoration. You're on restoration projects. So I would say between the two, what is your most favorite aspect of what you
Well,
do?
it's kind of remarkable that you said it, because the most difficult part of environmental restoration from from where I come from and what I'm doing, the most difficult part is the permitting of doing the work. It's an effort, and Victoria can attest to this. We spend a lot of time just trying to get permits in order to move forward with restoration projects. So the big challenges there is really all about design, and there's everything from legal aspects, like do you have the appropriate, does the owner of the property actually have ownership of the land? Do they have fee simple title to the land, or is there mining rights? A lot of times people don't realize sometimes they have property and there are mining rights there, which would jeopardize or potentially jeopardize a restoration project. So between the two, the most enjoyable part is the land management part, I think, and then the initial work that you do when you're going out to a site and exploring the site, just like I was describing before. You're exploring the site, figuring out what's there, and we will classify different areas. For instance, you mentioned longleaf pine flatwoods. That would be potentially a community type on the site. We would want to map out those areas and identify how much acreage is in that kind of ecosystem, and then the same thing with all the other types of ecosystems on the property. And then we would go from there, try to figure out what we can do, what's the problems that are out there, what's the nature, the current condition of the property. Is it in good condition or is it in bad condition? Is there anything we can do to rectify those issues that may exist on the property?
Okay. And so what is one of the biggest difficulties that you run into then? Do you find that there are not, that you have a hard time finding an example or comparative ecosystem to?
Well, a lot of times it sounds like you're talking about what we call target communities. We may have a piece of property, let's say a lot of the longleaf pine communities you were talking about before, as well as a lot of the wetland communities, especially a lot of the shallower type of wetland communities like wet prairie and things like that have been ditched and drained in order to create more area that they can convert to some kind of use. Like usually it's agriculture of some kind, whether it's cattle pasture. Here in Central Florida and south, as you move south especially, there's a lot of properties that have been manipulated, ditched and drained in order to create. I'm not talking about, absolutely getting rid of the water, but they control the water levels on the site, and they've degraded that element to the point where they can use it for other purposes. And so we are constantly we are looking for properties that we can do that with. So that may be, you talk about reference communities or target communities. That's what we would look at a property like that and evaluate it. Look at historical aerial photographs that are available at University of Florida, actually, in Smathers Museum, I believe it's called. And we can look at those aerial photographs and see all the way back to 1940, somewhere around there. And then we also can look at the soil types, and we can tell, okay, this soil type that's there is fairly consistent with, or reasonably consistent with, what longleaf flatwoods would be maybe. And then we know that's probably the case. And so we're basically figuring out what used to be there, and then we try to manipulate things or correct things so that we can return those historic conditions we call pre-Columbian times of Columbus.
Okay, so the historical trajectory has a lot to do with when you're
absolutely all of our efforts are to restore what has been there. There are situations where you can't restore the historical condition because of regional drainage projects or other things that have affected large areas. But in general, that's where we want to go, and almost all the mitigation projects that I work on, that's what we are doing.
Okay. And I live not too far from Circle B Bar Preserve, and that used to be that was a big wetland that was drained for agriculture, and excuse me, they came back in and they did culverts, and they have controlled flooding there. Mm-hmm. And it's great to see. I mean, I'm sorry?
Restoring the hydrology.
Yeah, restoring the hydrology is the first element you're going to have to deal with, bring back some of the wetland areas. That's so.
What's a wetland without water?
That means we often work with engineers because of that, and there's a lot of difficulties associated with hydrologic restoration. We have to make sure that we're not going to, by restoring the historical drainage patterns, that we do not flood just the adjacent property owner who may not want the property to be flooded, even though that may have been an historic condition. We are not allowed to do that here in the state of Florida.
Oh, okay. That's good to know. I didn't know that. Thank you for that piece of insight. So, have you seen any techniques that were phased out over time because they just didn't work, or they were they weren't cost effective, or they did more harm than good?
Well, one of the things there's a couple things that come to mind. One of the things is historically mitigation was done on what we call in the industry postage stamp type mitigation, and a lot of times there would be an impact associated with some kind of project they needed to compensate. Like I'm talking about a wetland impact. Maybe they needed an entrance road to come in, or to widen a highway, or something like that. And they have an impact that they have to compensate for that, the functional loss associated with that wetland loss. So they need mitigation. The way that it used to work, especially the further you go back all the way into the early 90s, it was more and more so that way, is that they would do things that were on the project site. So let's say if somebody needed an entrance road in order to build a subdivision on a property, they would, and they had to impact the wetland in order to get onto the property, they would go somewhere on the property and do the restoration or the enhancement or whatever the mitigation was. Maybe they may carve down an area next to the wetland, and in order to make an existing wetland on the site a little larger, and that would be their compensation. But one of the things that we've learned over time is that the responsibility for that mitigation and its perpetual success would fall upon the landowner, which in those cases would be a subdivision. And so the subdivisions are not in the business of wetland restoration or restoration of properties or land management, other than landscaping. So that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about restoration. So now that's been kind of phased out, and what's replaced it is for that kind of thing is mostly it's been mitigation banks. Now that's where Victoria comes in. She's a mitigation bank credit broker. So I'm on the side where I'm doing the permitting and initiating the land management associated with the restoration events that generate mitigation credits that can be sold to compensate for those type of impacts, whether it's a road that's being widened or something like that, a new road, or whether it's some other facility, a subdivision or anything like that that happens to be next to wetland. And here in Florida, there's quite often a wetland on your project, wherever it is. There's a lot of wetlands in Florida.
Yes, absolutely. There are, so many lakes and just, I mean, we're almost right at sea level here. So do you deal with, and I'm sorry if I'm getting off the topic, do you deal with coastal wetlands? Is it more inland? Is it marshes, bogs? What's your flavor?
All of the above. I work on a few coastal banks. I won't say several. I'll say a few coastal banks. Matter of fact, Victoria knows one that we were working on and got finally pushed through the pipe and came out the other end about, I don't know, that was a couple of years ago, maybe a year or two ago. And we're working on a couple more right now and trying to get through the permitting process in order to start doing that work. But the majority of the mitigation or the restoration projects that we have are inland. But that's just by virtue of area. There's we only have so much coastline and a lot more interior area, but we do both.
Yeah, and there's probably 90% freshwater mitigation banks and about 10%, and I'm totally estimating this, saltwater. And John, I think you're permitting one of the first seagrass mitigation banks right now, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Seagrass is a really big issue because there's no way to compensate for it. And so eventually we'll be able to have that. So that'll be a huge emerging market for Florida.
You can imagine all the expansion of existing ports. A lot of things that's been happening here in Florida. A lot of the ports are being there's been expansion to accommodate larger vessels and things like that, and a lot of times those could affect seagrass beds, and so that's where we're hoping to come in and provide compensation for those areas.
That is very interesting. I think that's something that obviously, as you two have figured out, that something that is missed. I feel like sometimes because we can't see it, we don't think about it. Out of sight, out of mind. And I see us going toward this trajectory, bigger, faster, better, but it doesn't always have to be that way.
Yeah. And I'm just going to interject real quick, just in case we have watchers that don't really understand mitigation banks. We probably should have done that in the beginning. But just to kind of give you a brief overview, and John, please plug in as I go, but mitigation land is a large parcel of degraded wetlands, land that needs to be fixed back to its natural state. And that's what we're talking here. And so John will do things that's written in the permit. Once it is permitted, he'll do things like, the prescribed burns, or restore the hydrology, or remove the invasive species and plant native species, and all these different activities that actually release the credits to be sold. So he has all that expertise. So I imagine, John, you go out on a new site, a potential mitigation bank, you're almost kind of like the artist, because you're like, we could do that. We could do this, we could do that. Somebody else comes in, they're going to have a different frame of mind. So it's really a creative environmental blanket, kind of. So I just wanted to throw that in there to connect with, if anybody's watching this, to understand a little bit better.
You're right. I think that where the art comes in most is just trying to figure out what was there beforehand. If things are dramatic, sometimes things are not that different from where they were, but they just have some minor problems that are easier to fix. And sometimes you went, like, for instance, when you get into the hydrologic work, that gets a lot more serious. That's usually there's a lot more to prove on my end to get through the permitting process and things like that. But and then you have some sites that just have a problem with they're relatively in the regular conditions, but they just haven't been burned. They're suffering fire suppression for years. And you may recall, we've had in the past decade, we've had a lot of fires here in Florida, similar in some ways to what's going out west right now. But a lot of that was because of fire suppression, and those fuel loads on those unmanaged properties, vegetation grew up, and the fuel, the duff layer or the fuel for a burn kept building up, got to the point where it was so bad. And then we had a dry spell, and we had some fires started. And as soon as they started, there was so much fuel on the ground that you can't stop it. And so you have to, of course they tried to stop it, and they could only do so much, but it burned a lot of acres before they could get control of things. So that's one of the things that we try to do too, is an element of what we do is also safety. It's keeping, by reintroducing natural fire. What we're doing is mimicking historic fire patterns, pyrogenic communities. We're talking about these ecological communities that were dependent upon fire pre-Columbian, in pre-Columbian times. So we could theoretically get a lightning strike in Tallahassee, and it would burn all the way to the coast in Titusville. So that kind of thing. And now we have all these roads, and we had Smokey the Bear and control forest fires and that kind of thing. And that we really were mismanaging for a while our native lands. So now we're a lot more conscious about that, and that's one of the things that we do. We'll bring back fire. That's a huge thing. It's important for appropriate plant densities and habitat community composition. It's critical for some species just in the reproductive cycle. I'm talking about plants that they do not reproduce unless they get a periodic burn, like once every 3 years or something like that. So we facilitate those kind of things, and we work with fire guys who do the burns and all those kind of things.
Okay, and that is very interesting. I mean, it's a lot more work than it sounds like initially. You think that it can just handle itself when really it needs aid at this point. So I'm wondering what happened, but I don't know if it's population or, excuse me, or the climate or other factors that are making these ecosystems dependent on human intervention, when historically that would have happened on its own, happened naturally, but now we're having to come in and prescribe the fire.
It's definitely a human. Definitely the management of habitats here in Florida typically require human intervention now, because of the fact that we don't have regular fires, because we have artificial fire breaks, roads and things like that prevent fire from moving from across a huge pyrogenic community like longleaf pine. Instead, it stopped at a road. It only burns 3 acres. It would have burned thousands and thousands. It only burns a little bit. Now we want, the other part of that is we have to do that appropriately. You have to burn it regularly in order to keep the fuel loads under control, and so that you don't end up with wildfire, because wildfire is damaging to everything from the soil, all the plants and all like that. You may be aware, you don't want the fire to get up into the canopy of these trees. So that would kill the trees. What we want is a low burning fire that moves across the landscape. And longleaf pine is a fire resistant species and really basically requires periodic burns. So, and I wanted to back up a little bit because I didn't answer all the question, something that Victoria brought up. One of the things is the funding of all this kind of work restoration efforts. And we have a lot of properties are native lands that are owned by or controlled and managed by water management districts and DEP. And there's some areas that are like Nature Conservancy and things like that are running like that. But the mitigation bank industry is a whole new element. One of the problems that we had in the past was that you just couldn't rely on funding to support a lot of the lands that are in that are government owned, and to add more property was going to be difficult, because that means they're going to have to manage. It costs money to do all that kind of management, the fire management, control of exotic species and things like that. And you talk to anybody who's from South Florida and talk about Melaleuca, Maluka, they spend millions of dollars on that every year. So in the control of that species. So, and there's a lot of other examples of that, but it requires human intervention now, and it's part of living with our native lands. We just need to be good stewards of those areas. Now, mitigation banking brings in my clients are typically landowners or people who are, more specifically, people who are in the mitigation banking industry. Now, what that means is they manage lands for a living. They are entities that the way they make their money is the sale of these credits. But their business, in order to be successful in this, is you have to be a successful land manager. So you have to hire people like me to do this kind of work and know what they're doing, get it permitted, and then they proceed to just manage the land, getting the appropriate people in a perpetual situation. You're on down the line, they make sure that there's actually requirements for funding that lasts perpetually. So they have to have like a trust fund set up that's going to produce so much money every year that's going to be used to manage these properties, to burn them correctly, to keep the exotics out, things like that. So it's a really good relationship where now we're bringing thousands and thousands of acres all the time, every year, coming in this mitigation banking industry that they're being brought in and put under conservation easements and being managed and for conservation purposes, and it will be so perpetual. But it didn't cost anything from a state budget or a government budget of any kind. So it's a great handshake between what we want to do as people who are in the conservation business or conservation perspective. It's a good marriage between that and private industry, where we can actually make it so that people want to preserve lands and manage them for conservation purposes, made in perpetuity. And this is going to be done where they're making money off of it, but they don't make money unless they're successful at doing it. So we all win.
Yeah, that's great. I see, and and thank you for bringing that up. Even what Victoria does too, because I didn't know that was the two of you working together in that.
Oh, absolutely.
To conserve it as well, not just to buy and sell these properties. That's amazing.
Yeah. He builds the inventory and then I can sell them, the credits. and an important thing to know is that preservation doesn't give much credits. It's really the restoration. So the more broken the swamp is, the more lift, the more credits you'll get. So
the more it's going to cost more to do.
Yeah, but you get a greater return at the end.
That's right. The big thing is you're not worried about. I think the biggest thing is the industry is driven by if there's a lot of impacts, there's going to have to be a lot of banks. There's going to have to be all this restoration, all this conservation has to be done. So if the economy is soaring, you don't have to worry about the budget with the state or with the federal government coming through and providing money to do this. Maybe that may not be possible. There's budgetary constraints, and instead it's these people, any entity that's going to need to impact a wetland, of course they have to avoid and minimize to the greatest extent practicable by rule. But if they can't avoid those impacts, then they can go to a mitigation bank and buy that. And all that does, instead of you go back to that, I was talking about the postage stamp mitigation rule, small area next to a subdivision, what good is that? Instead, it's going to this very large, this is going to be typically, 500, 1,000, 15, sometimes more than that, mitigation bank. And there's and those credits the majority of those credits, the vast majority of those credits are only come after they meet levels of success. So it's not like they get a mitigation permit and they can start selling credits. They have to perform and then they get the credits to sell. And if something goes wrong in that mitigation bank, then they'll freeze the credits. They can't sell the credits anymore. So it's a big incentive for that entity to maintain their bank and keep it running as well as possible.
Okay, well, that makes sense. It does. I mean, you can't have one without the other.
That's right.
So it just goes. Okay. And I've just got a couple more questions. I know I don't want to keep you guys for too long, so I'll try to, wrap it up. I know we both got to be very busy. Through all of this, through everything you've seen, John and Victoria, because you guys work together, so I guess it's a valid question for both of you. What would you consider the most memorable restoration project you've been on? Or the one that has had the most impact? You were talking about if it was so degraded, you get a bigger return, things like that. You bring it from 0 to 10, say. So, or do you have any projects like that really stick out in your mind when you carry with you?
I think the ones I'm most excited about, the ones I'm most frequent on my mind, are the ones I'm working on right now, really. But yeah, if you go back from there, we've had projects, and we had one project that's right on the St. Mary's River, right on the border with Georgia, on the Florida side. And that was the first mitigation bank that I got permitted through both agencies. So it was a real interesting thing. But the work continues. That's the crazy thing about it, is the work continues because we're in the we have two phases of the bank we refer to. One of them is the construction implementation phase. That's when you're doing the things like doing the correction to the hydrology, getting control of the exotic species, things like that. And then later on, you enter the long-term management. Everything's successful at that point. Now you're just maintaining. And we're still working on that one. We've got it permitted, and it's been implemented, and we're in that process now. So it's that's probably the most memorable one. And then I would say that one that Victoria probably knows about, can remember very well. We had a very interesting client on one week, and that was a lot of challenges came out of that project, and that was a coastal project, and a really good one that had the potential to and is going to restore a lot of mangrove habitat from areas that tore up from historic mosquito control efforts. And that's very common all up and down the coast, and especially as you go up from St. Augustine down through south of Merritt Island, a lot of the impounding of salt marshes and other things for mosquito control. That mosquito control was associated with control efforts that we really don't use anymore, tearing up the environment in impounding areas. That's something that was really 50s, 1950s, that type of thing, before they realized, we're messing up the environment a little bit, and such as the dusky seaside sparrow went extinct, for example. That was due to some manipulation of those habitats. So we like that. We like that project too.
Okay. Well, it sounds like you guys are just all over the place. I love it. It sounds like a very interesting, you guys are just constantly turning your wheels.
Yeah, well, it's fun because no land is the same, and so it's every single project's a different project with different challenges and different pros, and so it's been a really rewarding experience for me working with John for the past 16 years, and love picking his brain on all sorts of things. I do it weekly. John, what does this mean? What do we do with this?
Yeah,
so it's been a great resource for me, so I knew he'd be a great resource for you. So I'm so happy that you guys got to connect, and you have each other's emails. So if you want to connect at any time. Catalina, the one thing I can suggest to you, and we talked about this a little bit before the call, is an internship. And don't don't wait until after you graduate. And maybe it's not an internship, maybe it's a job shadow, because you have all this passion for this, but you haven't really ever done it. You've never really watched anybody do it or go out in the field and done a wetland delineation, or maybe you have. But I'd really say, maybe call John and say, can I job shadow you one day?
Sure.
Because I did that in the early days of my career of an industry I thought was going to be great, and I hated it. And then wetland mitigation fell in my lap, thank God. But I'm just saying, while you go through it, just take a day and meet with John or someone and really just so you can understand a little bit more, because there's nothing like experience. There's nothing that you can read in a textbook that's going to give you the experience. And so that's one thing I suggest.
I'd never heard of a course that really nobody goes to school. Let's put it this way: nobody goes to school to be a consultant, an environmental consultant, or to be a mitigation credit broker. Those were things that didn't exist that long ago. So those are fairly new. But it's a real interesting area and very confusing unless you actually get yourself out there. And I tell people when we get new people that come on, we hire new people or things like that. And after a little while, I'll go to them and they'll say, I feel a little lost and or a lot lost. And I say, you're exactly where you're supposed to be, because that's the way it is until you've been in it for a long time. But you get to do things, you learn how to do certain things, and that keeps growing, and you learn how to do those things until you master it.
Yes, and wetland mitigation is a phenomenal niche in the environmental industry, and so I'm so glad that you have done some research and you found us. And if you have any other questions in the future, just reach out to me or John.
Okay, absolutely. I think both of you will be hearing from me. I'm eager to get my feet wet.
Good.
That was a wetland joke. I would love to. I would love to have experience, but I feel like it's not to get too off topic here. We're running short on time. Not to get too off topic, but with a house and full-time school and 2 kids, it's a lot. So I want to give, excuse me, I want to give all that I can to whatever I do. So it's hard to juggle all of that. But if I could find something to where it would be a few hours, a few times a week, that would be awesome. I would love to actually, see the workings and, like you said, just job shadow.
Yeah, absolutely. Or just meet on
with either of you.
A site, inspection one day.
Yeah.
I'll come out and videotape it.
There you go.
Okay, cool.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for your time, and we'll talk soon.
All right, great.
Okay, no problem. Thank you, John, and thank you, Victoria, so much for having me, and thank you for explaining everything and taking the time to expand my knowledge on this and get to know a little bit better what it is that wetland mitigation banking does and what the role of wetland preservation does. So
yes.
Thank you so much.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. You guys have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.